John Crichton-Stuart, 2nd Marquess of Bute, KT, FRS, styled Lord Mount Stuart between 1794 and 1814, was a wealthy aristocrat and industrialist in Georgian and early Victorian Britain. He developed the coal and iron industries across South Wales and built the Cardiff Docks. Bute's father, John, Lord Mount Stuart, died a few months after he was born, and as a young child he was brought up first by his mother, the former Lady Elizabeth McDougall-Crichton, and later by his paternal grandfather, John Stuart, 1st Marquess of Bute. He travelled widely across Europe before attending Cambridge University. He contracted an eye condition and remained partially sighted for the rest of his life. Having inherited large estates across Britain, he married his first wife, Lady Maria North, in 1818, and together they lived a relatively secluded life in Mount Stuart House in Scotland, one of Bute's 4 seats. Bute was dour but industrious, with a flair for land management. He focused his daily routine around extensive correspondence with his estate managers, making biennial tours of his lands around the country. The couple did not conceive any children, and Maria died in 1841. Bute remarried 4 years later to Lady Sophia Rawdon Hastings, and she gave birth to Bute's only child, John, in 1847. Bute was a member of the House of Lords and controlled the votes of several members of the House of Commons. He was a political and religious conservative, a follower of the Duke of Wellington, but rarely took part in national debates unless his own commercial interests were involved. Early on, Bute realized the vast wealth that lay in the South Wales coalfields and set about commercially exploiting them through local ironmasters and colliers. He constructed the Cardiff Docks, a major project which, despite running heavily over budget, enabled further exports of iron and coal and magnified the value of his lands in Glamorganshire. When violence broke out in the Merthyr Rising of 1831, Bute led the government response from Cardiff Castle, dispatching military forces, deploying spies and keeping Whitehall informed throughout. The contemporary press praised the Marquess as the creator of modern Cardiff, and on his death he left vast wealth to his son. Background and personal life. Bute was the son of John, Lord Mount Stuart, and the former Lady Elizabeth McDougall-Crichton. His parents were both from wealthy, aristocratic backgrounds. His father was due to become the Marquess of Bute, with extensive landholdings in Scotland and in South Wales, and his mother was the sole heir to the Crichton estates, with over 63,980 acres of land in Scotland. Bute's father died in a riding accident in February 1794, leaving Elizabeth to give birth to Bute's younger brother, Patrick Stuart, later that year. Initially Bute was brought up at Dumfries House by his mother and grandmother, but following their deaths he passed into the care of his grandfather, the 1st Marquess of Bute, and travelled with him across England and Europe. His family considered him to be clever, and he went to study at Christ's College in Cambridge in 1809. Over the next few years he visited the Mediterranean, Scandinavia and Russia, taking a keen interest in land economics. He developed an eye condition during this period and became partially blind, leaving him unable to travel without assistance or to tolerate bright lights, and finding it difficult to read or write. His maternal grandfather, Lord Dumfries, died in 1803, followed by his paternal grandfather in 1814, with Bute inheriting both sets of estates and adding Crichton to his surname after Lord Dumfries. As a consequence, he held many hereditary titles and posts. In addition to being the Marquess of Bute, he was also the Earl of Windsor, Viscount Mountjoy, Baron Mount Stuart, Baron Cardiff, the Earl of Dumfries and Bute, the Viscount of Ayr and King Garth, Baron Crichton, Lord Crichton of Sanquhar and Cumnock, and Lord Mount Stuart Cymru an Inchmarnock, and a baronet of Nova Scotia. He was the keeper of Rothesay Castle, the Lord Lieutenant and Custos Rotalorum of Glamorgan, the Lord Lieutenant, the hereditary sheriff and coroner of Buteshire, and a high steward of Banbury. Bute had 4 major seats: Mount Stuart House on the Isle of Bute, Dumfries House in Ayrshire, Luton Hoo in Bedfordshire, and Cardiff Castle in South Wales, with his London townhouse on Campden Hill in Kensington. Bute preferred to live in Mount Stuart House. He disliked London and only spent a few weeks in Cardiff Castle each year. Twice each year he would travel from Mount Stuart House through Ayrshire to Edinburgh, down through northern England to London, and on to Cardiff and his South Wales estates. In November 1843, a fire swept through Luton Hoo House, destroying the interior. The house's historic library survived, however, and most of its famous collection of paintings were rescued from the blaze. It was subsequently sold off by Bute. Concerned about his growing blindness, and not enjoying the social life in London, Bute retired to his estates on the Isle of Bute for the next 6 years. While recovering, Bute married his first wife, Lady Maria North, in 1818. Maria was one of the 3 daughters of the 3rd Earl of Guildford, and a wealthy heiress. £40,000 was settled on her at the time of her marriage, and she was due to inherit a third of her father's extensive estates. Contemporaries considered Maria a kind and pleasant woman, but she was often unwell and the marriage proved childless. In 1820 his portrait was painted by Henry Raeburn, and published 2 years later as an engraving by William Wood. In 1827 his father-in-law died and Maria inherited lands worth over £110,000. The historian John Davis describes Bute as dour, remote and overbearing on first acquaintance, but with a sense of responsibility, considerable imagination and an enormous capacity for hard work. By the aristocratic standards of the day, Bute lived a reclusive lifestyle. As a result of his personality and poor eyesight, he did not enjoy hunting, shooting, or large social gatherings, nor did he like race horses or gambling. His first wife's illnesses added to this sense of exclusion from wider aristocratic society. Compared to other landowners of the period, Bute was relatively philanthropic, giving away around 7 to 8% of his rental income from South Wales in charitable donations. For example, he was keen to fund local schools and to construct new churches, partially because in doing so he was able to discourage any moves towards nonconformism and a disestablishment of the official church. In 1841 Lady Maria died, and Bute blamed his excessive focus on the dock program for exacerbating his wife's illness. As a result of the original marriage agreement, Bute continued to draw the incomes from his late wife's property for the remainder of his life, even though officially the estates would ultimately pass to Maria's sister, Lady Susan, on his own death. He was created a Knight of the Thistle in 1843 by Queen Victoria. In 1845 Bute fell from his horse and injured his eyes further in the accident, making it still harder for him to read and write. Bute remarried the same year, this time to Lady Sophia Rawdon Hastings, the daughter of the Marquess of Hastings. Sophia was obsessive, hard to please, and did not get on well with John's family, especially his brother. She soon became pregnant, but gave birth to a stillborn child. The couple's second child, whom they named John, was successfully born in 1847. Bute's relationship with his brother Patrick was often difficult. The political views did not coincide, as Patrick was much more liberal than Bute and favoured political reform. although Bute arranged for Patrick to become a Member of Parliament in 1818. In 1831 their differing views resulted in Bute removing him from Parliament. For many years, Patrick had good reason to expect that Bute would die childless, leaving him to inherit the family estates. After Bute's death, he disputed the occupancy of Cardiff Castle with Lady Sophia. Landowner and industrialist, estate management. Bute was determined to develop his different estates and receive the best possible return from them. He was an active, ambitious manager, quick to generate new ideas for the properties, and spent the majority of his time managing his properties. Despite his poor eyesight, he wrote at least 6 letters to his managers each day. He had a detailed understanding of his various estates and businesses. He attempted to keep up with affairs in Glamorgan, for example, by reading the local Welsh newspapers from his house in Scotland and through exchanging letters with influential local figures. Bute recognized that his land holdings were too extended and disparate to be easily managed and attempted to rationalize them. He attempted to sell his Luton estates in the early 1820s but failed to obtain an adequate price. He successfully sold them in the early 1840s. Luton, who was finally sold in 1845, by then comprising around 3,600 acres. Unusually for an aristocrat of the period, Bute owned almost all of his lands fully as an owner in fee simple, rather than having his rights diluted through arrangements with trustees. When he married in 1818, Bute placed his English and Wales estates into a trustee arrangement for any future children, but this agreement expired with Lady Maria's death in 1842. When he remarried in 1845, a similar trustee agreement was set up, although in this version the Glamorgan estates were administered separately from his other holdings in England and Wales. Bute continued to run his network of estates and estate managers personally, helped by Onesiphorus Bruce, a barrister agent and close friend. As early as 1815, Bute had his Glamorgan estates fully surveyed, which highlighted that the estates had been neglected for many years and were now in a poor condition. Edward Richards became the senior official in charge of the estates by 1824 and represented Bute on both estate and political affairs across the region. Despite this, Bute retained the final authority over even quite minor issues on the estates, including making decisions on the buttons to be used on local school uniforms or the reuse of a broken flagpole, for example, which could result in considerable delays as letters were sent between South Wales and Scotland. As the complexity of the Glamorgan estates grew, more officials were appointed to help manage the docks, farms and mineral interests, but these all reported separately to Bute, putting increasing pressure on the Marquess. On the Isle of Bute, the Marquess expanded his properties, purchasing land in Ascog, Kilmaharmag and Ettrick Mill. Glamorganshire. Bute was closely involved in the developments across Glamorganshire during the first half of the 19th century. The region saw tremendous economic and social changes in a short period of time. The population almost trebled in the first 40 years of the century and industrial output soared, with the output of pig iron increasing from 34,000 to 277,000 tons between 1796 and 1830. Industry and mining replaced agriculture as the main sources of work. In driving forward and responding to these changes, Bute transformed his South Wales estate into a major industrial enterprise. Bute's landholdings in Glamorgan were spread out across the county and he took steps to consolidate them, selling around 1,800 acres of some of the outlying properties in the west and investing heavily in buying 4,600 acres of land around Cardiff. Between 1814 and 1826, The rising prices of land and the costs of the docks brought an end to this expansion. Estimating the profitability of the Glamorgan estates is challenging because of the way that the accounts were drawn up during the period, but estimates suggest that once land purchases and the dock building cost were factored in, the estates cost the Marquess much more than they delivered in income. Bute borrowed heavily. He had inherited debts of £62,500, but by the time of his death owed £493,887. Financing and supporting this debt was difficult, particularly during the early 1840s, when credit was hard to come by and John was forced to juggle lenders and different lines of credit. He believed that ultimately his investments would provide a rich return, and in 1844 noted that he thought well of the prospects of my income in the distance. The economic growth across South Wales drove up the demand for new housing for the growing workforce. Bute was not prepared to sell any of his lands for housing, and did not see much profit in building and renting housing himself, but was prepared to lease land in the growing urban areas and mining communities for land development. Initially he attempted to negotiate 63-year-long leases, which would have given his successors additional, early flexibility in how they managed the land, but these proved unpopular, so he reverted to offering the more typical 99-year leases. None of the contracts offered by Bute allowed the lessee to buy the freehold or automatically renew the lease at the end of this term, which ultimately resulted in substantial political difficulties for the third and fourth Marquesses when there was a storm of complaints in the late 19th and early 20th century. Bute left the style of the early developments up to the lessees, but was concerned by the poor results. Bute then began to approve the designs for new buildings personally, laying out some grand streets in the centre of Cardiff and retaining open areas for eventual use as parks. Very little money was invested in the sewage and drainage systems for his new developments, however, and a damning 1850 inquiry showed that this had resulted in cholera outbreaks across the town. At the start of the 19th century, scientific investigation began to indicate that the Glamorgan valleys were rich with coal deposits. Bute, who already owned coal mines in County Durham, commissioned further surveys in 1817 and 1823-24 which showed that there were potentially huge profits to be made from the reserves, both from the coal sitting beneath Bute's own lands, but also from the coal under common lands in the region that Bute could claim through his feudal titles. Bute set about consolidating his rights and existing investments during the late 1820s and 1830s, acquiring extensive rights to the coal fields in the process. Bute established and managed a few collieries, such as that at Regos directly, but given the investment costs and attention they took up, generally preferred to lease out his coal fields and claim a royalty on the coal mine instead. The lessees might be iron masters, who used the coal in their own operations, or colliery owners who sold the coal on to industrial or domestic customers. The profits increased from £872 in the second half of 1826 to £10,756 in 1848-49. Cardiff Docks. Between 1822 and 1848, Bute played a central role in the creation of the Cardiff Docks. The idea was first put forward to Bute by one of his staff in 1822, who suggested that, with the right investment, Cardiff could be transformed into a major port for exporting coal and iron. The existing seaport, used by the Glamorganshire Canal, was small and inefficient. The new port would then deliver a direct return to Bute from shipping rates, improve the value of his lands in Cardiff itself, and increase the value of the royalties he could charge on his coal fields. Initially Bute opposed plans for docks put forward by the local ironmasters, but then changed his mind and pushed forward with his own scheme shortly afterwards. The first phase was to build a new dock and connecting canal in Cardiff, making the Glamorganshire Canal redundant in the process, at an estimated cost of £66,600, considered to opponents to be a wild speculation. Parliamentary permission was acquired in 1830, despite opposition from the local canal companies of ironmasters. The project proved more complex than originally planned, driving Bute to become irritable and angry with almost all of his associates. But the dock opened successfully in 1839. The costs of building the docks had been far more than anticipated, however. Instead of the original estimate, construction costs had soared to £350,000, reaching £10,000 a month in 1837. Bute had to mortgage his local estates to raise the sums required to finish the project. To make matters worse, when they first opened, the docks did not receive the traffic he had expected, particularly from the larger ships. Bute put this down to a coalition of ironmasters and others intent on ruining him. Bute responded by putting commercial pressure on shipping companies to abandon the Glamorganshire Canal and using his feudal rights to force shippers to move the wharfs to his docks. His efforts paid off, and although trade through the docks only came to 8,000 tons in 1839, they then rose quickly, reaching 827,000 tons by 1849. Between 1841 and 1848, the docks brought in a gross income of just under £68,000, a relatively disappointing figure compared to the size of the investment. Successive marquesses would find themselves under huge pressure to continue investing and expanding in the docks and subsequent phases of construction over the coming decades.